Hi, this is Madeline Sheldon, and I will be leading the next round, the lightning round session, and it's focused, on navigating your implementation. So we're going to have about 4 lightning round presenters, and then, at the very end, we'll have a short presentation. If the participants could hold their questions until after the final session, I appreciate it, and then we can, and then, I'll let y'all know when to chime in with your questions. So first up, we have Krista Oldham from Clemson University. And Krista, I see your slides. I can, also see your presentation view. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that.
What about now?
That looks great. Thanks.
Perfect.
And I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you all, and it sounds like folks can hear me. And I wanted to first go ahead and apologize for my attempt at a very, very sad, punny title. On second thought, I realized that maybe it's not as funny as I thought it was, but I figured I am amongst friends and that you all will forgive me for this. So I wanted to start off and give a little bit of background in order to frame and provide context for my presentation. I have been in my current position as the University Archivist at Clemson for about a month and a half now, so I'm still really, really new here. And before I started my position at Clemson, I was at Haverford College, which we just saw a link to the Tri-College instance of ArchivesSpace. So I was at Haverford College, which is a small just outside of Philadelphia. And coming to Clemson, I was really excited to have a new job and to have different experiences, to do things at a very different scale. But one of the things that I was really excited about was the fact that I kind of got to do a little bit of a do-over for implementing ArchivesSpace at Clemson. And I was able to kind of bring a wealth of information and experiences that I had by implementing ArchivesSpace at Haverford and with the TRICO. And for folks, I'll be referencing the TRICO a little bit in my presentation, but the TRICO is a consortium between Haverford College, Bryn Mawr College, and Swarthmore College, and we share a well, not we anymore, but they share an instance of ArchivesSpace, and so a lot of the experience that I was able to bring was kind of from that perspective to my place here. And a lot of that wealth and experience came from working in a consortium and trying to figure things out with a number of different stakeholders with very different priorities, but also I brought a lot of experience because I did a lot of training with student workers on how to use ArchivesSpace. And so Clemson University Clemson University Special Collections and Archives implemented ArchivesSpace back around 2014-2015, about 5 years ago, and currently we are in the process of working on a local ArchivesSpace manual to get everybody on the same page, address legacy descriptive practices, which we all can attest to and we all have. It's our own dirty little secret that we like to think nobody else has, but we all do. And so we're working on that. We're working on developing workflows and our own local conventions for our finding aids in concert with best practices. And we're really, again, as many people are in implementing ArchivesSpace, wanting to focus on this to develop this kind of very systematic approach and procedures for us using ArchivesSpace and its implementation. And that's where we are with Clemson. here at Clemson, and so I will kind of cue my flashback sequence. I hope everybody enjoyed that. So my experience, as I mentioned, was at Haverford College. We were in a little bit of a different place for implementation. We began implementing ArchivesSpace and training back in 2016, and when we decided that we were going to go to ArchivesSpace, we hit it, and we hit it hard, and we hit it fast too. And when we set up, when I was working with them and we set up our implementation, we had varying levels of kind of implementation teams. There was this larger ArchivesSpace planning team that kind of broke down into technical implementation, so kind of working with all three of the schools to set up all the technical needs and address those and set up permissions and things like that. There was also a metadata team that looked at focused on identifying standard elements that we would require at a collection level. Since we all three were sharing an instance of ArchivesSpace, we wanted to all be on the same page, and we also had to keep in mind that we were also feeding our finding aids to the PAC School, the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections and Libraries, so to kind of keep in mind that we needed to have our finding aids meet those standards as well. And we also had an implementation team that focused on cleaning up our subjects and agents that migrated over with Archivist Toolkit, and for lack of a better phrase, they were a hot mess. They needed a lot of love, and so we had those varying teams, and a lot of people put a lot of hard work and effort into getting us kind of like at a clean slate, cleaning up. Not everything was perfect, but we had everything where we wanted it to go. We had very clean agents. They were all checked for authorities, and we were on a good path. And in addition to kind of having this implementation team at that tri-co level, that consortial level, we also then worked at each college on local implementation. And part of what that local implementation looked like was setting up an ArchivesSpace manual. And it was myself and two other curators and full-time staff members worked on the manual, and we made, I think, one fatal error, which was we kind of chunked it up into, you take this section, you take this section, you take this section, and we did get together and look at it as a group, but I think we could have spent a little bit more time. And I believe our public interface had been launched for about a year at this point now. So we were in a very different place than where we are here at Clemson currently. But what I wanted to focus on was talking about my work with training students and kind of words of wisdom that I can share with you all. For Haverford and like many other institutions, and I think we'll hear one later in this lightning round, we rely really heavily on student workers to complete everyday archival tasks. At Haverford, there were only 3 full-time archivists who wore many different hats. I, at the time, was also the records manager. Our other archivist was also the head of special collections, rare books librarian, and then we had another one that, again, wore many tasks, so kind of that everyday processing that needed to get done was really handled a lot by our student workers. And part of that decision was just really a lack of time and a lack of resources to have that work be done by professional archivists. And at this point, we were very, very lucky to be able to work with students and figure out which one of our student workers was a really good fit to do the work of processing collections and working within our collection management system, which was at one point in time Archivist Toolkit, and then now had shifted to ArchivesSpace. So at that point, we had a small number of students actually working in ArchivesSpace, and we were able to really kind of keep up with the level of quality assurance that we wanted to do on our part. And again, this was done fairly easy because we had a small number of students and we were able to determine what was the right fit, what students could do this work and would be successful at it. And this was all great. This process worked out really, really well because we were very fortunate to have student workers that kind of started with us as freshmen and stayed till seniors. So we had 4 years of kind of building a wealth of knowledge that students were able to kind of build on each semester and get more comfortable working in the system. And that all worked great until this happened. Haverford started a big renovation, and what that meant for us at that time was special collections was going to be closed. We were not going to be providing access to collections, and this meant that we had to basically tool all of our students to doing processing, otherwise we would lose those hours. So at that point in time, we were having anywhere from 3 to 5 student workers processing collections at any one time, and keeping up with that was quite a handful. So we had to kind of think of a variety of tools and needing to scale to handle that quantity of students processing and working in our systems. So I kind of revamped our training and had focused on trying to develop different templates and tools and ways in which students could work in ArchivesSpace, or not in ArchivesSpace, but still do the data entry that we needed. Created, again, as I said, a lot of templates, a lot of prompts within the system, used a number of different guidelines. We had that manual. I was able to distill that down into very easy to read charts, and did a number of combinations of one-on-one trainings and group session trainings. And I will say, and I think everybody knows this at this point, spreadsheets are your friends. They were really easy to work with, especially with student workers. They felt comfortable working in spreadsheets. It's something that they're used to doing. The data is structured in a way that we can play and massage it to the way that we need. And students, I think, felt really comfortable in spreadsheets because they felt like they could mess up there as opposed to in this system. And what I kind of learned from that process, and I can share offline or maybe in the notes section share more of my templates and tools that I used with the students. But what was amazing about this process, not only kind of how training student workers helped me refine how to talk about ArchivesSpace with people at varying different levels, it made me really appreciate the idea of having a central kind of like authority and central training, because what I realized is while I was training students to do something very consistently, my coworker was training their students to do something different. So while we were trying to create consistency, we weren't being as consistent with training our workforce that was doing the data entry into ArchivesSpace. And so my hard lessons that I learned was create manuals and best practices, the devil's in the details. I swear my colleagues right now probably think I'm being very pedantic by kind of making them be really explicit in our current iteration of the manual, but I've seen the pitfalls of where we lacked consistency at my previous institution. And I always want to, my other parting thing is trying to standardize the experience and be consistent, invest in that centralized training. It may be a very front-loaded, heavily weighted, but it's really important and helpful to do. And it'll create hopefully better data in the end. And I also would say that embrace it as an iterative process. You always want to plan for the future and try to make everything perfect, but take those moments and assess and make the needed changes, because I think now that I get to have my do-over again, I know that I need to bake in more parts to test our temperature and feel out where we are with how we are training students and our other colleagues. And I know we're saving questions for the end, but I always feel compelled to throw in a question slide. And here is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. I did put my Twitter handle up there. I will self-admit I'm a good retweeter. I'm not a good tweeter, but feel free to tweet at me, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
All right, thanks so much, Krista. I really appreciate it. All right, so next up, let's see, we have Danielle Butler from the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. Danielle, if you wanted to go ahead, and share your slides. Excellent. And I can see your slides.
Okay, and I think I am unmuted now?
Yes, that's correct. I can hear you.
Great. So I just wanted to start not at the end. Hold on. Sorry. Oh, it doesn't want to cooperate with me. Technical difficulties. All right, let's try this again. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to give some background on what version of ArchivesSpace we're running, how long we've been doing this. So we began our implementation process in spring of 2018. We completely migrated in August of 2018 to version 2.3.2, which is the version we are still running. We haven't upgraded. We're still working through data cleanup and some staff training kinks. We're hoping to upgrade this quarter. We don't use a lot of ASpace's more robust functionality. Our goal with migration was to manage accession records, resource records, agent and subject records for multiple repositories because we have multiple projects within our collection that we manage with different repositories. And so we basically just needed ASpace to replace what we were using Archivist Toolkit for because we couldn't get our Toolkit instance to stay up. It kept crashing probably once a week. We do hope to expand what functionality we use in the future though. So our typical workflow basically is to either import EAD created by an EAD XML encoded spreadsheet into ASpace for large collections or manual data entry into ASpace. And then we take the data back out of ASpace and upload it into our Content DM instance, which not a lot of institutions use Content DM for finding and hosting. So if you're interested in seeing what that looks like, I do have in my presentation, which I shared in the notes document, a link to our online catalog so you can see what that looks like if you are curious. And we don't use the PUI because of that. And so basically our implementation process was getting administrative buy-in from our library system, implementing a test instance, implementing a server instance, migrating, then doing staff training, data cleanup, and I just wanted to share some goals we have for the future. So with administrative buy-in, so some background on our repository, we're the Arkansas History and Genealogy arm of the Central Arkansas Library System, which is a 12-branch public library system in the Pulaski County area in Little Rock. So the manuscripts division is just a really small piece of this already unique department of the library system. And so lobbying for resource-intensive changes proved pretty difficult. So before I started the library system in 2017, the division had already been looking into migrating from our existing Toolkit instance to a locally hosted instance of ArchivesSpace. But they didn't have anyone on staff with the knowledge base to explore it. So when I was hired, there was basically an expectation that I might be able to assist in migration given my background. The division was able to lobby my time and the knowledge I had to devote to migration, as well as the membership platform provided by ASpace as IT support to get administrative buy-in from the library system. And so whenever I started this process, I had some knowledge in how relational databases worked, but I had never implemented a system like this or manipulated any data in one. I had never written any manuals for staff to use. Basically, I was starting from scratch. When I was hired, basically they said, oh, you're a millennial and you have some digital knowledge because I had done digital projects before taking this position, so basically you will be great at this. So there's fortunately a lot of information out there, even without any base knowledge. I was able to find a lot of resources even before we acquired membership. It took me a bit of trial and error to get a test instance running, and I did that before we asked the library system for membership and to implement ASpace. And I think it was valuable for me as the day-to-day administrator to implement the test instance to begin with. And it was a really important part of getting administrative buy-in. I think that they saw that the staff was committed to creating and managing this. And also that there was someone in our department willing to do the work to understand the program going forward. So after I created the test instance, I used that instance to create a user manual while IT worked on implementing a server-based instance for us to use. So we just have a locally hosted instance that's on a SQL-based server. So I created a staff manual, and I've linked to that there, and it's also linked in the notes document if you want to look at that. It's very intensive. We have 6 archival processing staff and 2 staff members that have access to ASpace data, but are not doing data entry. They're people doing digital object stuff, so they need access to the description to write metadata. And there's a really large generational gap in our staff. I'm the youngest person by a couple of decades, and so we have a lot of what might be considered extra information in our manual about how to use ASpace. It's very basic, and so that was important for our staff though, because they just aren't very technically savvy, and so I had to basically write for the staff that we have. And we've still had some hiccups with training. We did 2 lab sessions in guiding them through creating a resource record, adding things, etc. And then they kind of worked on their own in the sandbox for a while we waited for our instance to be ready. And so by the time our instance was ready, they were pretty familiar with the program, and they've been working in it for, I guess, a little over 6 months now, and it's going well. We do still have some training hiccups. And then after we got everything migrated using the Toolkit plugin, another staff member and I isolated 8 collections for data sampling. So we basically compared what data we had in Archivist Toolkit, because we had these instances running concurrently for a little while, with what was in ASpace. And for some reason, we only decided to look at resource records. We never looked at accession records. We never looked at agents. We never looked at subjects whenever we did migrate all of this data anyway. And that ended up being a problem later. We found out that all of our agents didn't default to publish, so I had to consult the membership list to figure out how to write a SQL query to get the agents to publish, so that was fun. So I did some cleanup there. I also had, so we export all of our EAD out of ArchivesSpace and manipulate it using a style sheet. And so in order for the date to appear after the description, we had to separate it with a comma. And for some reason, my predecessor thought that we should, rather than put the comma in the style sheet, we should put the comma at the end of every description. And so the commas appear duplicated in the PUI, which isn't particularly important at this moment, but as I'll explain a little later on, we are hoping to use the PUI at some point, so we wanted that data to be clean. And I also didn't want my processors to keep having to put commas at the ends of things. So we had to delete all the pesky commas, fix all the agent situation stuff, and modify some workflows to work better with the way that ASpace deals with data rather than how Toolkit did. And so that's kind of been what's been going on over the last 6 months, and I feel like we've finally gotten to a point where every day I don't find kind of a new problem. So that's positive. And so just some future goals for us. We want to implement the PUI at some point. Our workflow is really heavy for getting finding aids out of ArchivesSpace and into our catalog system. It works for us now. We're in a consortium with the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. So our content DM instance is shared with them. Our digital objects are hosted with them, and our finding aids are hosted with them. And so there's been a lot of talk about how to do consortia in this block today. And so hopefully I can take some of that back, and that'll help us brainstorm how we're going to do it, because that's been our main hiccup at the moment, is just how do we use the PUI and still maintain our joint agreement with the university. So that we also do not manage our locations in ArchivesSpace right now, and I think that would be really helpful for us to do. We tried to do a shelf read recently, and it was very hard given what data we have on where our collections are physically located. It also may help us prioritize space, so that would be really nice. And we also don't do any processing prioritization with accessions in ArchivesSpace, and I think that would be a really great thing to start doing. And also potentially installing the Harvard plugin I mentioned that we use in XML encoded spreadsheet. That's from the PACSCL project. I probably just butchered that acronym. And it's an older spreadsheet, so old that I tried to share the link to go get the spreadsheet, and the link is dead now. So if you would like that spreadsheet, though, it works very well. We create EAD and we import it. And that works for us, but the Harvard plugin will probably work better. And we also use Content DM to host digital objects, so any digital object integrations that would be forthcoming for ArchivesSpace would be really beneficial for us. So I think that's about everything. And if you have any questions or comments or any consortium suggestions for me, that is my contact information there. So thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Danielle. I appreciate it. Okay. All right. So next up we have Carolyn Runyon, and they are from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. So Carolyn, when you're ready, feel free to share your presentation. Okay, great. I can see your presentation. If you want to make sure your microphone is on.
Yep.
Perfect.
I needed to unmute first. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
Give me just 1 minute.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. So I don't want to cover the same thing as Krista did in the first presentation for this sort of lightning round in this block. So I might skip around a little bit. I'm gonna do my very best to make this not redundant, however. So I hope you'll bear with me, and if there's something that you want to hear more about, of course, please ask. So I want to thank you and thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to discuss this topic today. I'm really excited about it, and something that I feel passionately about is how we engage student assistants and interns and volunteers in the work that we do in archival repositories. There's a team of 2 faculty archivists in my special collections unit. We have recently, very recently, maybe 2 months ago, I think, just a month and a half ago, have gained a third person who helps us with our archival projects. So in the past 5 years, we have supervised more than 20,000 hours in 149 different student assistants, volunteers, and interns in our repository. And so along the way, we've learned a few things about getting them to work really competently in ArchivesSpace and what it takes to do that. So one of the things that's been sort of hardest for our student assistants to work around is, or one of the things I think is interesting is, the application is predicated on expert knowledge of archival principles, which is something that none of our sort of unexperienced staff, I'll call them our sort of part-timers, our student assistants, interns, and volunteers have. I seem to recall the Archivist Toolkit billed itself as a tool for archivists by archivists. I think it's even more true for ArchivesSpace. It really is a tool that's designed for experts. So this poses a real challenge because we absolutely rely on our student assistants to do a variety of jobs in special collections, ranging from archival processing to digital object description and digitization. So it's really important for us to make this something that we can do reliably, from selection and placement to training and that ongoing management. So I wanted to talk a little bit about selection. We have a pretty standard position description with duties and qualifications, and that expands not only to our paid student assistants, but to people who donate their time to special collections. And we do that purposefully. We think that it's important to communicate not only what we need from them, but also what they might gain by working from our repository. A lot of folks are looking for those transferable skills and exposure to professional software that archivists use so that they can go on, to graduate studies or careers in the profession. And so we really pitch that as a selling point. And we think that that helps create sort of a target audience for who we want to work with in special collections. We have a very formal application and candidate review process. We require for volunteers and interns a cover letter, their resume or vita, and a little application form that we require mostly for paperwork purposes. We also interview the candidates face-to-face or via web conference, so as close to face-to-face as we can get if they're not local. We require candidates to state their goals so that we know we're on the same page. Sometimes special collections isn't the right fit, and we want to make sure that we know that from the jump, as opposed to finding it out later that they want to do something totally different that we might not be able to help them with. We work hard to make sure we're passing this, what the U.S. Department of Labor calls the primary beneficiary test, which in essence, I'm really boiling it down to the bare essentials here. Basically, the primary beneficiary of this sort of volunteer or intern labor, specifically intern labor working for credit, is that the primary beneficiary has to be the student and not the archivist. And we really take that to heart, and we try and make sure that we apply that same sort of test to our volunteers to make sure that we're looking at this as this isn't a free labor source. That's not the point. The point is to engage volunteers in the work that we do, and so it's much more of a programmatic or outreach kind of project that we do, or program that we do. And I think that archivists tend to, or lots of us, if someone says, oh yeah, I want to volunteer to help, if they're not the right fit, if they're not meeting some of those required qualifications that you might have, and that you need out of volunteers, it is really okay to politely reject applicants in the same way that archivists politely reject really generous offers of donations of material that simply aren't right for your repository. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Obviously, your selection processes need to be fair and equitable, paid or unpaid, it doesn't matter, but selection needs to actually be selection. And for me, that's one of the hardest things to do when somebody comes in and they really want to intern and it's just not the right fit. There's a better opportunity out there for them. And so, we go over that. But it is a little bit miserable and uncomfortable maybe. We have a mandatory orientation for all of our student assistants, interns, and volunteers that we do 3 times a year. It's currently clocking in at about 90 minutes, but I think it could go longer, really. We go over everything, and it's fast. It's a fast-paced orientation. It's interactive. One of the most important things we go over is some basic policies about working in special collections, like, how to call in sick and those sorts of things, but also how to find materials in special collections, how to conduct research, what our holdings are, how to handle material, that sort of basic thing. So it's really interactive, and it's meant we also, throughout the presentation, really strive to recognize the importance of student and volunteer labor in serving our patrons and making our content discoverable. And it's that sort of theme will go throughout the presentation in our interactions with students. We really try not to miss a lot of opportunities to tell our student assistants how important their work is, so that, you know, I don't want them to feel pressured, but a little bit, maybe I do. I want them to feel like the work they're doing, it's not busy work, it's mission-driven work that helps us serve our patrons better. So we follow up this orientation with a multi-module test that we used to administer in Blackboard, but we found that limiting, so we've moved it into a Google Classroom situation where our volunteers, you don't have to have the sort of, you don't have to authenticate through the university's central authentication system. So we have moved that into a different setup, and it goes over everything that we went in orientation and more. It provides instructions about how to do things and then practice how to do things. It takes students about a week to complete all of the modules. And one of the modules, I won't name them all, is working with ArchivesSpace, and it has real world examples. You know, we might have a scan of a page or something about how to format date expressions according to our local standards, how to determine circa date ranges, how do we devise titles for materials according to our local practice, how are we using controlled vocabularies, how are we basically applying metadata in ArchivesSpace. And we have a whole guideline that we refer them to that they use, much like the handbook that Krista sort of mentioned in her presentation. So we work really hard to make sure that everybody passes that ArchivesSpace test, and especially if we think that they might be working in ArchivesSpace, that they pass it at 100%. And every year, students retake different modules, or we have, you know, sort of second year modules that advance their knowledge over time. So it's really built out into this nearly untenable edifice of testing. But we feel like that's really important. And it makes sure that everybody's on the same page and getting that same training. So the training between me, our university archivist, and our processing archivist is the same regardless of who you get. They're getting the same information. Once we've done the orientation and had all this training for our student assistants and volunteers and interns, we think about placement. So for interns and volunteers, we have this beefy selection process that I've described earlier that requires the cover letter, the resume, and the application. We also require interns to craft a proposal as their first assignment, so that we have this set of mutually agreed upon projects and goals for their internship. And it's something that really centers our work and that we refer back to over the course of the internship. For student assistants, we have sometimes a little bit less control over the selection process for that. In fact, in the past, we've had no control over it. It's whoever the Office of Financial Aid sent over. It was part of the federal work-study program. So lately, it's been maybe a little bit better. I'm not sure. It's students whose schedules don't maybe work with the library's reference desk schedule or don't have the requisite technical skills to work in our studio/makerspace. So we have kind of another sort of test that we do. We happen to handle both the digitization and archival work for the University of Tennessee. That's handled all in special collections. It's not sort of separate. So we usually put our student assistants on a super basic scanning project. It'll be like, you know, scanning a yearbook or scanning a course catalog, something that is really pretty easy to accomplish. And we check that work. And when they struggle with that, we know, okay, that's a student that we're going to put on the kind of project that's like cropping and deskewing scans for 15 hours a week. And they're perfectly happy on that. That's what they want to do. It's easy peasy. They don't have to think a lot about it. They can just sort of zone out and do the work and, you know, do it to our standards. Perfect. But some students do a really nice job on that. And So we take that and we take their sort of test scores and we sort of chat with them, and for some select students, we give them different work. We give them a lot of work in ArchivesSpace. So we definitely have sort of a, I guess it's a probationary period where we think about the students and we try and place them where they're going to be most successful. So that brings me to management and mentorship. The first most important thing, I think, and you know, this is my own personal bias, of course, is documentation. We have really robust documentation. It's constantly growing. I would say, in fact, if you don't have this written down, you're probably not ready to engage students and volunteers and interns with any project, frankly. It really, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but when a student has a question, I'm out of the office, I'm in a meeting, I'm helping a researcher, they have something to turn to. And what's more, we sort of approach this documentation as a collaboration with our students. When they ask questions, it often leads me to tweak our documentation and make that known to the rest of the crew here in Special Collections. So documentation isn't just an edict throw down for the student assistants. If they spot, you know, sort of a failure in logic or something that's really fundamentally missing from the documentation, we add it in. It's always iteratively being improved. The other thing, I think maybe you have heard the phrase before, if you sort of think about pedagogy in any way, but there's this phrase, grade early, grade often. And so we do that in Special Collections. When a new student in particular, a new intern, a new volunteer is working with us, we look at their work early on, we give them a small project, we check it really carefully, and when the work is good, we move to like sort of sampling and checking that way. We tend to break our projects up into small steps, particularly in ArchivesSpace, so the student doesn't have to understand necessarily the whole picture up front. It's broken up. So we start with a spreadsheet like so many other folks, and we are exploring the Harvard plugin, I think, like so many other folks. So we clean up titles, we sort data, we do groupings, we come up with our processing plans, we do all sorts of things in spreadsheets that are really a little bit cumbersome to do and accomplish in ArchivesSpace.
Hey, Carolyn.
And
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we do need to wrap up soon.
okay, sure.
So sorry.
So I'm almost done, I promise. So anyway, we work in the spreadsheets, and then we actually have another student assistant run a QA check on that spreadsheet. We do our QA, and then it goes back to the original student assistant, and they sort of take a second step to copy and paste into ArchivesSpace. So there's a lot of QA built into that to make sure that everything looks right and looks good before it goes online. So I'll end there with that. I think the others are somewhat self-explanatory. And yep, thank you for giving me a little time to talk about our process.
All right, well, thanks so much. I appreciate it, and sorry for interrupting. All right, so next up we have Lorraine Steward from the University of Southern Mississippi.
Hi, Madeline, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Great.
And
Wait, I have to wait for that to come down.
yeah. Okay, looks like it's down. You can upload.
All right. And let me go to begin.
Okay, I can see your PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so are we ready?
I can see your notes, your presenter notes, just FYI.
Can you? Because, oh, darn.
I mean, that doesn't bother me. You know, if it doesn't bother you, you can go ahead and.
Yeah, I think I will because I have two screens. I didn't realize it was going to do that.
Okay.
Does that?
No worries.
Or let me see. Does that work better?
Yes.
Okay, I just had to switch the screen. All right, well, great, thank you. And I just wanted to begin tonight by saying that ArchivesSpace has been in use at Southern Miss for less than a year. And during that time, our focus has really been on the transfer of our legacy finding aids. So I'm going to talk about strategy rather than technology. And also only in recent weeks have we begun to explore the system's other functionality. Now, as background information, we have 3 curatorial collecting areas and special collections, which you see listed on the screen. In addition to being head of special collections, I'm the curator of historical manuscripts and archives. Now, while there are manuscript holdings only in the DeGrumman Children's Literature Collection and in my area, our curator of rare books in Mississippiana is responsible for our reading room. So she is also quite invested in our descriptive practices for these materials. In total, we have 2,200 manuscript collections measuring more than 15,000 cubic feet. In addition to the 3 curators, we have 8 staff members, and for this project we enlisted 4 of our trusted student workers, some of whom are at the graduate level. This is the former homepage for special collections, which was redesigned in the year leading up to the implementation. And this was one of our pages for our historical manuscripts finding aids. Now, virtually all of the 800 plus collections in historical manuscripts had finding aids if they were processed, or online accession records if they were not. However, because permission is required to access most of the university archives material, no finding aids existed for those holdings. Finding aids for the DeGrumman collection were accessed from a separate page, which you can see was fairly bare bones. DeGrumman had only legacy finding aids or accession records for 800 or so of its collections. There were also about 500 collections with accession records available only internally, and you can see those are the non-linked names. DeGrumman also had 91 finding aids that had been created in EAD version 1.0 early in the early 2000s. Other finding aids and special collections have been created in HTML using Dreamweaver or in ModX, an open source PHP content management system. When I started at the university in academic year 2017, implementing ArchivesSpace was on my wish list because of its support for the EAD schema and its collection management functions. I really wanted a unified interface for all the special collections finding aids, which we do have now, although we haven't done anything to the design, so it's still quite simple. Staff and I welcome the news that we'll be getting an ArchivesSpace hosted instance through LYRASIS. We got that news in June of 2018. However, we were not as thrilled to be asked to complete the conversion by December of that year. Between historical manuscripts and DeGrumman, we had more than 1,600 records to transfer. My first step was to create a description working group which convened to discuss strategy, and this isn't all of us, our curators were missing for this meeting. We had to decide whether it was worth it to attempt a true migration. Partially because there were so few existing EAD finding aids, we decided to manually transform the data, i.e. cut and paste. So the group also felt that touching each record would allow us to correct egregious errors and impose some standardization, although because of the timeline it was understood that few improvements would be made. It was a conscious decision to do what might be called a, quote, minimal level manual migration. There was not a lot of familiarity with EAD or DAX in the working group, which is the first thing I set out to remedy by providing resources for everyone to study. And we met to confer over the fields we were going to use to define the parameters of the contents and to determine the extent to which existing content would be edited. Danielle Bishop, our DeGrumman assistant curator, had the most staff expertise, and she compiled this manual incorporating our decisions. And the manual allowed inexperienced staff and students to help. The lion's share of historical manuscript finding aids was completed by, well, really all the finding aids, was done by our assistant curators for the most part, and our records management specialist who had been reassigned from her normal duties, as well as our 4 trusted students. Now, we had many legacy finding aids that were less than perfect. For example, that included information and scope and content that was better suited to an arrangement note. Some effort was made to quickly separate this information, but there was no serious editing of content. We felt even small improvements were of more benefit than if we had just done essentially a data dump. And so that was the attitude we took with it. Another change that we did opt to make was to eliminate the antiquated practice of using parentheses in titles. But we did hold off on checking Library of Congress name authority files, although we have checked several since the new year. At the same time, we started adding Library of Congress subject headings. Our legacy finding aids did not have subject headings. These were assigned instead by our university library catalogers to the manuscript MARC records. With the pending upgrade of Primo, which will search across the library catalog, our digital repository, our Preservica instance, and our finding aids, the MARC manuscript records were phased out. So I felt that it was essential that we include the subject headings, and I also required at least 1 genre term. For many collections, we had extensive item-level photo logs linked to the legacy finding aids. Because of the time frame, how to treat the photo logs was a point of consternation. Our container list, we had developed a simple rapid data entry template, and we felt that trying to drill down to the item level with this amount of descriptive data within the time frame was just not feasible. So temporarily, at least, we've opted to use the index field, and this may change as we consider ways to integrate digital objects from our digital collections into our finding aids in the future. ArchivesSpace has also allowed us to pull disparate resources together. Here, our Mississippiana curator has used it for the general and genealogy vertical files. And the university archives have begun to create similar finding aids for its open records. For our session records, we made the decision to create minimal level finding aids, which we labeled as unprocessed collection under level of description / other level. And that might seem like an unusual decision, but it helps with our processing workflow. Many of these accessions have been arranged and inventoried at a folder level, and we're just going to add scope and content and biographical notes, and then they will receive no further description nor arrangement, and this will exceed the requirements for minimum level finding aids. In recent weeks, we've begun to use the assessment module to assign numeric value to prioritize our processing. And I'm really looking forward to this being particularly useful in addressing our backlog. By December, historical manuscripts had entered all 857 finding aids and accession records thanks to the Herculean efforts of our staff and students. DeGrumman completed nearly 400 legacy finding aids for process collections. They had a vacancy on top of all this. And next they will tackle the minimum level finding aids. As of today, we have transferred 1,254 collection level records. That's it.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, so we have one more presentation, and this is a short presentation. It's for, Kaitlyn Rizzo is the next presenter, and she is from Pennsylvania State University. So Kaitlyn, when you are ready, go ahead, share your slides. Okay, great. I can see your slides. And don't forget to turn on your mic.
I should be unmuted now. Is that correct?
Yes, I can hear you. And
Okay,
I can see this. Okay, perfect. Yeah, great.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to start by saying thanks so much for joining in today and for attending this talk. My name is Kaitlin Rizzo, and I am currently the head of collection management at Eberly Family Special Collections Library in Penn State University. So hello from Happy Valley. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we have started here at Penn State in the past year, which also coincides with when I started my position. So I came on in June 2018, and in a little under a year actually now, we've been working on the work that I'm going to present now in this presentation titled Moving Up and Moving In, Reusing Data to Promote Sustainable Locations Practices with ArchivesSpace. And I want to point out before I go into kind of the depth of this presentation that I'm extremely fortunate in that I work at a large institution with a lot of really wonderful colleagues, including two colleagues that I want to shout out at the beginning. Ruth Tillman, who is our cataloging systems and linked data strategist at Penn State University. Ruth and I have undertaken a lot of the work that you'll see in this presentation together, and I just want to be very clear that while Ruth is presenting in the later section in Block C, and you should all go see it because it's fantastic, Ruth's work is really what made this possible, and so is the work of Ben Goldman, who is our digital records archivist at Penn State. Ben laid a lot of the foundational work for ArchivesSpace. Penn State is a charter member of ArchivesSpace. We adopted very early on, and we have Ben to thank for a lot of that initial work to get our accessions in, our resource records in, and to argue for things like hosting at our institution, which leads me to my third thank you, which is to Blake Carver, who is our LYRASIS contact and who has been really wonderful in his help for us. Okay, so all of those thank you said, and now that everyone knows a little bit of the lay of the landscape, that while I'm presenting this is lots of people's efforts, let's get into the presentation. So I wanted to start with a little bit of context about where this project started and really how it came to be. As the title of the presentation suggests, the impetus for this work began with a large collections move in the summer of 2018. In August of 2018, Penn State reached occupancy on a newly renovated storage facility. So prior to the opening of this annex, approximately 60,000 linear feet of holdings had been distributed across 5 separate buildings throughout our campus in pretty much a 5-mile radius. The new facility was a huge boon for us. It allowed us not only to improve physical collections for our holdings, but also to consolidate our collections into fewer physical locations, which as a new collections manager was great because it meant I was learning 3 annexes instead of 5. So over the course of August, Penn State moved about a quarter of our collection, so 13,000 storage containers, into the newly renovated building. This was the culmination of many years' work on behalf of many people in our institution and in our collections, and our special collections in particular. So the year before I got there, a couple of people, including Elizabeth Hobart, who was our Special Collections cataloging member, our former Associate Head of Special Collections, Matt Francis, and our accessioning archivist, Ali Zawadzki, had all collaborated to pull and correct thousands of rows of location data from the library's catalog. And that locations data was initially intended just to map containers from old collection spaces into the new facility. And the data included things like barcodes, locations, and collection identifiers, titles, and box numbers for every different container that was moved.
So as a new collection manager, this really presented kind of a treasure trove of information for me as I was starting to learn the collections. Of course, treasure is relative. While the newly corrected data was a thing of beauty, it was not without its peccadillos, shall we say. So it's important for me to stop here and to note that location data at Penn State University is a little bit tricky for archival materials. For at least the last 5 years in our institution, locations information has existed in 2 places. The university library's catalog, in which the location information appears as part of a compound local call number field in the backend database. So it's the location plus the collection call number plus the box number in one kind of cell. And a local Excel spreadsheet, which we refer to as our space spreadsheet. So it's important to note also that these 2 sources were not equal. The space spreadsheet lived on our local area network and was kind of the source of record. It included data not only about locations for public collections, but also open locations, the last known locations for missing materials, and just some kind of side notes that didn't appear in our public catalog. However, unfortunately for us, around the same time that we were working tirelessly to correct the data that appeared in the catalog and in our space spreadsheet, we learned that, like many institutions, our IT was ending its use of local area networks for file sharing within departments and moving us all to cloud-based storage on Box. This would have been great if Box could handle the size of our space spreadsheet. But after we worked with IT and came up with a short-term solution, it became obvious that in the long term, we were going to have to move away from one giant space spreadsheet to handle 60,000 linear feet of materials. So barely 6 months into the job, and I had a few large problems on my plate. On one hand, I had 13,000 boxes that had moved and another 11,000 that we were going to move by March, and which we are currently moving. That was a challenge, but that was really going to serve the collections. On the other hand, I had 2 different methods for managing locations, and I knew that both methods really didn't work for the long term of our archive. So it was time for a third option. Necessity is the mother of invention, after all. And the third option for us was ArchivesSpace. We had a really robust instance of ArchivesSpace. We had accessions and resources in. We had locations for our new facility already in, but we didn't have a plan for how, or really kind of any guidelines for how we might move all of our locations and our data about location management into ArchivesSpace. So this is what we did next. The first thing I did was to find help in the form of Ruth Tillman, who is our cataloging systems and linked data strategist librarian, and she's also just our resident metadata wizard. Ruth and I mapped out a plan over 2 hours about how we might crosswalk the information that we had just gotten out of the catalog and corrected into data that we could use to push back, to import back into ArchivesSpace via the API. So Ruth and I mapped out the logic of where we were, where we needed to go, and what information we needed to get there. We used Python and the ArchivesSpace API to pull all of our existing top containers from our instance of ArchivesSpace and started to map out what we needed to know about the containers in the space spreadsheet to get them back into ArchivesSpace and connected to their locations. And so on the right, I've included some of the original JSON that we pulled from the ArchivesSpace API just to see what the containers look like, how we might link them, what information we needed to know about each container, etc. And so this is very much still a work in progress. So I'm going to switch a little bit into the present tense to reflect where we are. Right now, we are at the point where we're getting ready to re-import data from our workflow, or sorry, not our workflows, our library's catalog into ArchivesSpace to link those containers with their location. And the way we're getting there is through a couple of tools that you've probably heard about multiple times today. One huge one has been the ArchivesSpace API to pull existing data so that we can match it to the data from our space spreadsheet. Another one has been Open Refine so that we can, parse data and make matches between the two existing sets of data that we have. ArchiveSnake has been a huge help to us. There's a lot of out-of-the-can scripts that we've used to get all of our top containers to run really normal kind of reports. I have a little 2-bit code of Python that I use anytime I'm matching, and that has been super helpful, but also the ArchivesSpace community, Dave Mayo, I know Ruth has talked to a couple of times. And so all of these 4 things together really have made it possible for us to start seriously thinking about better practices for location management and to start getting control over this unwieldy practice we had. And so I'm going to kind of roll through this last slide pretty quickly just to finish up. But I want to leave on this note about the key takeaway from this for us, which has been that now we're thinking about how we're changing our location practices, not just in terms of getting things into ArchivesSpace, but as we come into ArchivesSpace, thinking about more holistically how we make that data more reusable, more durable, and practices better for the next time. So for us, this has included things like not making compound fields where the data is collection number plus location plus box number. Making that data more granular, which ArchivesSpace is facilitating, but also thinking about what that means for how we manage locations, who gets to create locations, how they're created across our buildings. And that's been the most important takeaway from this project so far. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. But thank you to everyone, and I will be happy to answer questions soon.
All right, well, thanks so much, Kaitlyn, and thank you to all the presenters. I really appreciate it. Okay, so for those of you that have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I know we're at the top of the hour, but I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions if you have them, and I'll read them aloud. I do wanted to let y'all know that Christine has put in a link for ArchiveSnake in the chat. So Christine, thanks for doing that. And I did see a question earlier in the presentations, or I'm sorry, during one of the presentations that asked about training for colleagues. So Carolyn, I believe you talked about, training for student assistants, interns and volunteers. But do you have any thoughts, advice, or tips for training colleagues?
Yeah, maybe. It's not the same. I certainly don't quiz my colleagues. But I think I take a really careful approach with colleagues. I know with, my direct reports, we have a regular meeting and we sit down, and those are really working meetings where we, they ask questions and we try and come up with answers together and think about that. So I think about that training as a collaboration, and we talk a lot about, how we can, what kinds of things that maybe are gaps that I can help with. But, I'm really lucky. I have a team of archivists who really embrace that, and that training can be, it can be hard. And the other thing is, I'm the director of special collections, so in some ways it's a little bit easier if you're training, say, 2 colleagues who are maybe at the same sort of bureaucratic level or whatever you want to call it. That can be a tricky thing to negotiate sometimes. So the other thing that I try and do is if my colleagues know something I don't, and I hope they know a lot of things I don't, is that you know, that goes both ways. So it has to be open. I have to be able to I have to be willing to learn from them. And that openness, I think, has helped us sort of work through things together and figure things out and complement each other's gaps. So, yeah, but no, I don't, some of the tried and true tricks I use with student assistants, I don't necessarily employ with my colleagues.
All right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your feedback. And Krista, you know, if you're still on the line, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think currently, you know, I mentioned our process right now at Clemson is we're in the process of making a manual, and we have somebody on our staff that's kind of taking the lead. And at Clemson, for the most part, we don't have students that are doing from like a start A to ending at Z in processing collections. They're helping to do processing, and I don't know, and again, I'm pretty new, so I don't think they're actually touching ArchivesSpace. So a lot of the training that we're kind of wanting to develop that's coming out of this manual will be for our colleagues. And I think, you know, our staff right now has varying levels and different skill sets. And I think what we had just heard about kind of, you know, needing, as we're doing this manual, it's kind of like an open workshopping through the manual, because, you know, relying on all of our employees and staff who are processing collections to bring their experiences and the work that they've done in collections to us, because we always find out that, oh, well, what do we do in this situation? And it has helped us to think through and work through some of the questions, and how do we want this to be for when we have the ability to set up those kind of local conventions, local ways of doing things. It has to be that open communication. But I found, you know, that some of the same things that I would employ to train student workers, we are adopting for staff members. I don't think we'll be doing quizzes like we just mentioned, but still kind of trying to figure out ways to lower the barrier for people coming to ArchivesSpace at all levels and their level of comfort too.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I also wanted to point out that Dave Mayo in the chat had said that they're actively looking for feedback about ArchivesSnake. You know, especially any common uses case. I cannot speak today. Especially any common use cases that it doesn't support yet. So, you know, if you've used ArchivesSpace or plan on using it, then feel free to document those use cases and send them to Dave. Are there any other questions for the presenters? I do have a question for Lorraine. I was just wondering, do you have any, and I asked this earlier on the other block, but do you have any, I guess, feedback or something, you know, for those who are newly implementing, you know, or haven't implemented yet, do you have any lessons learned, you know, or words of advice that you wish you had known before you got started that you can offer?
Well, you know, I was thinking that when we were given that tight deadline, that, you know, I was wishing that we had more time. But truly, now that we've done it the way that we have, I'm happy, you know, because we can always go back and clean up the data. I think probably the most important thing, which and Krista was just saying that, is that like the working groups where you just meet and you really discuss different scenarios, and you get a lot of buy-in, and then you come to a consensus, and then you document. Mm-hmm. And that to me was what kind of carried us through and allowed us to use a lot of different people, you know, with varying degrees of expertise, and have something in the end that was pretty, you know, consistent as far as content.
Okay. Thank you, Lorraine. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Danielle, how about you? Do you have anything else you want to add? You know, any final thoughts or lessons learned? I cannot speak. Lessons learned. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I think that this is kind of a piggyback on the training thing. Because of the place I was coming from. So basically I was a newer employee and I had been put in charge of this implementation process and writing all of this policy whenever before I got there was no policy written down at all. So this was a really big change for staff that some of them have been there for 3 decades. And so I think being really careful and not kind of the contrary to what was just said, not pushing timelines too much and not overwhelming staff, because I think I could have caused a lot of problems if I wasn't patient and willing to listen and willing to write the kind of manual and provide the kind of training that was going to meet their needs. And also, like everyone else said, be there to listen and modify. And really it is iterative. And that version that I shared in my slides, I think is the 6th version of the manual, and we've only had ArchivesSpace for like 6 months. So I make changes all the time, and we're all still kind of learning together. So yeah, just be patient. Nothing goes as quick as you think it's going to, and you always have to be cognizant of your environment. So yeah.
Those are really good points. Thank you, Danielle. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat box, so I just wanted to close with Kaitlyn because I do have a question for you. So you mentioned some very, very technical resources, you know, as a larger organization, you know, I know you do have those resources afforded to you, you know, you might have the budget or the staff or, you know, colleagues who can really assist you. And, you know, I know you have a technical background, but do you have any advice for, you know, any up and coming, you know, ArchivesSpace users who, you know, aren't as tech savvy, but they're really, you know, trying to dig in and, you know, inform themselves? You know, do you have any good tips?
Sure. I do think I want to be clear too. Like the main technical resource, I know sometimes Python can be scary, but the Python that I'm using for all of this work is literally 2 lines. And, you know, it just says, look at these 2 CSVs. If you see a row that has the same name, merge these 2 CSVs, which is something you could do in Excel. So I guess my big takeaway is the tools are not that important. There's a lot of tools you could use that will help you. The people are really what's important. And, you know, yes, I get to work with Ruth, which is its own kind of benefit. But if Ruth wasn't there, you know, the resources don't go away because the ArchivesSpace community. I mean, that's the whole point of using ArchivesSpace. You're not just getting software that's open source, you're getting a community of practice and development. And I've been in 2 instances now, one at the University of Maryland, which was unhosted, and one at Penn State University, which was hosted. And it's funny to me that while those are 2 vastly different experiences, the one constant was that there was always someone in the community to email. And so, you know, I talk a little bit about scripts. I'm happy to share my scripts. I'm not great about putting things on GitHub because I'm doing a lot of things and I just get lazy. But I know that there were lots of people that we reached out to, lots of colleagues from former institutions, colleagues from institutions across the ArchivesSpace community. And really, it was more always about the people than the tools. So I guess that's my big takeaway. Just ask. Don't be afraid to ask because everybody's in the same boat of learning how to figure it out.